All right, I will turn the recording off once the Q&A starts so that folks can speak freely. But we are going to host a recording of this on Fort's Educators Corner. I'll make the link available to that to everyone and also to those who registered. You can keep your cameras on or off. It doesn't matter to me, whichever is easier for you. Do keep yourself muted if you're not speaking, because there are quite a few of us here. You're welcome to put questions in the chat, especially if you're somewhere where you can't speak out loud. But I will just note that because this is being recorded, the chat is not private. So be careful what you put in there. If you have friends who can't make it to this session, there is a second session on Thursday. The information for that has been circulated to folks. I'm going to post my little housekeeping message once again in the chat. But aside from that, we're going to make a start of it. So give me a second while I share my screen. Can somebody give me a thumbs up that you can see that? Thank you, Allison. All right. So as mentioned, this is a not too long webinar, hopefully, about the academic job market and differences and similarities in the US versus the UK. So I'm going to talk you through some information, probably too much information, for about 30, 40 minutes, hopefully not any longer than that. And then we'll have around 30 minutes for questions. I hope to get to any questions and all questions that you have. So why are we doing this? Well, and I'll speak from my own experience here, more and more academics who are trained in either the US, and here I'm going to lump Canada into that. Sorry, Canadians, I know you're a separate country, or in the UK, are going on the job market in the other country, or in both countries. Sometimes that was certainly the case for me. And you might think, because countries ostensibly share the same language and similar historical academic traditions, that the markets might be similar. That is not the case. The academic job markets in the US and the UK are very different, with different norms, different procedures, different expectations. And unfortunately, there's very little guidance that's publicly available about these differences. You sort of have to either figure it out yourself or have a friend or a mentor who can teach you, which is not helpful. Finding information is the hard part. And so I hope that this session and the slides and the recording can be useful resources for you, for your colleagues, for your friends, as you try to navigate this. Who am I and why do I think that I'm qualified to talk to you about this? As may be obvious from my accent, I am not English. I am from the US. Originally grew up in the US, did all of my formal education in the US. I did my undergrad at Knox College in Illinois, which is a liberal arts college. If you're from the UK and you're like, I don't know what that is, we'll get to that. I did my MA and my PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Very different kind of institution. But now I'm working in the UK. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham, which is a Russell Group institution. If you're from the US and you're like, what's that? We'll get to that. I went on the job market in both countries, along with many others, and there are reasons that I did that, in 2020, 2021, that cycle. If you remember, that was right at the height of COVID, so I had additional complications, but the part that I want to talk about today and build on today is the experience both of those markets and the ways that they were different from each other. I'm now also in a department that hires a lot, and have sat in on any number of interviews, dozens of interviews actually, with folks from the US and the UK. So I'm witnessing hiring from the other side and seeing how folks in the UK are responding to particular people, and how they're evaluating things that may be different from what I was taught when I was on the US market. So I've seen both sides of it and I've lived both sides of it, and hopefully have learned something from that. Otherwise, it was a deeply traumatizing experience for no reason, but happy to share that knowledge with you all. So what we're going to do for today, for the next 30, 40 minutes or so, and I will try and time myself, is talk through three main things. First, going on the market, what that looks like in both countries, timelines, job ads, where to look for job ads, what those job ads are going to tell you, what they're not going to tell you, what types of jobs are available. So not only job titles, but also different kinds of institutions that you might want to work at. Then we'll talk through job applications, what's required for applications in both countries, which is quite different, as well as some tips for things to include or emphasize that may not be intuitive. Then we'll talk about the interview process, which may feel a bit premature, but I like to live in an optimistic world where we're all going to get those. What the interview process looks like, what to do, what not to do. And then we'll have time for Q&A. Because there's so many people in the room, and just so this doesn't become a free-for-all, if you want to have me to clarify anything, if I use a term you're not familiar with, feel free to put clarification questions in the chat and I'll answer those as I go. But if you have more substantive questions, please do save those to the end. There will be plenty of time. So no need to rush or feel like you might be left out. Always good to put some scope conditions on what we're doing. Here are some caveats for today. First is that there is definitely variation in the job market across disciplines, especially big disciplinary differences, the natural sciences versus the humanities, for example. I'm a social scientist. I'm a political scientist by training. I work in the politics department. There are subtle differences between those two things in the US and the UK. But my point is that what I say applies most directly to the social sciences. It probably has some overlap with the humanities. It may have very little to do with what goes on in the natural sciences. Those are not things that I can speak to. So just being aware that I'll do the best I can, but your mileage may vary depending on your discipline. Also, there's variation across institutions. Every institution has slightly different hiring practices. That is especially true in the US, where there are simply more institutions and more kinds of institutions. So if you've been through this process before and I'm describing something and you say that wasn't my experience, that's quite possible. There is quite a bit of variation. I can only share what I've gone through and what I've witnessed others go through. I'm not here to tell you which country is quote unquote better or not to apply somewhere. There are naysayers in both markets. There are plenty of problems with both markets, which you're probably acquainted with those, at least in your home country. I'm not here to judge you for reasons why you might apply in any place. That is your business. My goal is to help you enter either or both markets informed, with eyes wide open, about the advantages and the pitfalls. Last thing, terminology in both countries, again, despite ostensibly sharing a common language, is super confusing, with the same word sometimes meaning completely different things in the other country. I'm going to try my best to translate across US English versus UK English. If I don't explain something or if I inadvertently confuse you, please post in the chat. I'm happy to clarify language quickly. All right. So with those caveats, let's get into what this actually looks like. So starting from the first step, going on the market. What does that process look like for folks? In the US, the market runs much longer than it does in the UK. It runs generally August to March. Now there will be jobs posted outside of that window, but the bulk of postings will appear within that period. And those are for jobs starting in the next academic year. So for those of you going on the market in the US in the autumn, so July, August, you're starting to think about your applications now. Those are for jobs that will start in 2024. So in some cases, you will apply for a job over a year before the job actually starts. That is how the market cycle works. The way it's sort of structured and built into PhD programs is that you are expected to go on the market during the final year of your PhD. This is because there's generally no expectation in the US that you have your PhD when you apply. For most jobs, again, there are going to be some exceptions, but for most jobs, the expectation is that you are ABD, all but dissertation, which means you're at the dissertation write-up stage. You may not necessarily have your PhD yet, but you will within the next year or so. What this means in practice is that you're writing up your dissertation and you're on the job market at the same time. This can indeed be very stressful, but it is very much the norm in the US system. This is what the vast majority of people go through. The UK is different. The UK market is much more variable. Now, there are particular institutions in the UK that are trying to be like US institutions. Here I'm thinking about Universities like the London School of Economics, UCL, University College London, they will post more on the US schedule because they're trying to attract US candidates. Outside of that, however, most jobs in the UK tend to be posted in the winter or spring, so a bit later than in the US cycle. There'll be some posted in the fall, but not as many, and there'll be some posted later in the summer as well. First, that will start then in like a month or two. A good example is my own job, which was posted in April. I applied in May, I was hired in June, and I started in September, all the same year, which is very fast for the US market. There are also jobs that start in the winter. That is not really a thing in the US unless you are on an adjunct contract, and I'll explain what that is. But in the UK, you can start a permanent position, our equivalent of a tenure track position, in January. It's not the most common option, but it's a thing that exists. It's not weird. The reason for this variability is that folks in the UK go on the market, generally speaking, again, there are exceptions, after finishing their PhD. This is because many jobs require you to have a PhD in hand at the time of application. This can feel very weird if you're coming from the US or Canada. And it is changing a little bit. I was still ABD when I was on the market in the UK, in part because my department was trying to hire US folks, and it worked. But generally speaking, a lot of jobs still require a PhD. The job ad will say if they don't, but just be aware that that's generally an expectation. If it's not clear in the ad, that's something that's worth emailing the search chair or whoever the contact is in the ad about and asking, like, hey, do I need a PhD at time of application? There are some trade-offs to this, right? Like, on the one hand, when you are writing up your dissertation in the UK, that's all you're doing. Well, besides having a life, hopefully, and maybe a job and family stuff and all of that, but you're not on the market at the same time. That can be less stressful. However, it can also lead to more financial precarity afterwards, because you then have months, if not longer, on the job market when you're not getting paid, which is a problem. That's kind of how the cycle works in the UK. What do job ads actually look like once you've decided when you're going on the market? In the US, these job ads, and here I'm speaking specifically to the social sciences, this may be different in other fields, they're often more general. For example, you might see a posting for an assistant professor in comparative politics. And there might be some subfields or very specific things that the department lists as preferred areas of focus under that, but that's probably what the posting is for, some relatively broad subfield. A special note for my discipline here, because this is different than in the UK. In the US, IR, International Relations, is a subfield of political science. It's not its own thing. Just something to be aware of. You might see a job posting for an assistant professor of political science, and it might actually be an IR job, but you won't know that till you read the ad. Where to look for jobs, most people on the US market are members of APSA, the American Political Science Association. Again, I'm speaking specifically to political science here. Professional organizations, whatever those are in your subfield, I would encourage you to figure out what those are, because they have their specific job boards, and that tends to be where most people go first. Those are not always free, which is not great. So there are some other resources that you can use. These are general resources that apply to every discipline. Higher ed jobs is a good place to look. Chronicle Vitae is a good place to look. I have hyperlinked on the slide, and these are slides that I will circulate. A crowdsourced list of other job boards that we put together a few years ago. That is pretty comprehensive. Again, it's geared towards political science, but there are other options there, especially for folks in the social sciences. In the UK, job ads can be extremely specific. You might see an ad, for example, for an assistant professor in the 19th century history of Cuba. I made that up, but that sort of level of specificity, this sort of general, like, we'll take anybody who could teach this general subfield, is less of a thing. Those general postings exist, but they're rarer and they're coveted because people who don't fall into specific narrow niche subfields can get those jobs. Oftentimes, you will have to actually create an account on the institution's website before you can see what application materials that they want. This is an annoying way of stealing your data, but that's what they do. You're going to have to probably make an account on these institutions' websites through the link in the job ad to learn more specifically about what they want from you as an applicant. Where should you look if you want a job in the UK? Jobs.ac.uk is the main place to look. It's free, it updates very regularly. You might also look at Times Higher Ed. And then again, there are any number of other job boards that exist for specific professional associations and specific disciplines. But I would say jobs.ac.uk is the big one. Where are you getting these jobs? This is an intimidating table, and I'm going to walk you through it. My point in showing it to you is not to fully explain the educational system in the US, but to really drive home, especially for UK folks in the room, that the US is enormous, which is easy to say, but hard to wrap your head around. And there are tons of institutions, A, and B, tons of different kinds of institutions. And it's worth understanding a little bit about how US institutions are classified. This is a brief overview, and there will be people who squabble with categories that I've put these institutions in, but here we are. In the US, and some of these are things you probably have heard of. The Ivy League, which is generally considered the top tier. Tiers are silly, prestige is silly, but this is how it's constructed. This is your Harvard, Yales, Princeton, Stanfords. All of the trappings of prestige, the stereotypes are true that you might expect of those institutions. Then you have R1 institutions. These are research-intensive universities. These are most similar to the Russell Group in the UK. Most of your large state schools, which are public institutions, government-funded, are going to be R1s. This also includes some private universities that really devote a lot of money to research. If you are somebody who is research-focused, if that's what motivates you to be in academia, that's the kind of institution you probably want to be at that will most fit your priorities. That could also be true for R2 institutions. R2s tend to be slightly smaller, slightly less research intensive. The subtext here is that they don't have quite as many resources, but are still very focused on research. Then you have liberal arts colleges, which are much smaller. I went to Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. When I was there, the entire student body was 1,400 students, which is very different from a large university experience. Because it's so small, it's really focused on student experience, on teaching. If you're somebody who is driven more by teaching and service within the academy, this may be the kind of place that you want to apply to. There are any number of other kinds of institutions in the US, which I won't belabor. Regional publics, which is where most students in the US actually go, that are more teaching focused. Religious institutions of every persuasion, although Christianity obviously huge in the US, and then community colleges, most of which offer 2-year associate's degrees that people can then go on to do a full bachelor's degree, a full undergraduate degree, or it can stop and it can be a vocational qualification, but there are lots of those in the US as well. The UK system is not quite as complicated, in fact, largely because it's a smaller country. In the UK, this is how I've come to understand the differences in sort of tiers, if you want to think of it about it that way. The so-called Golden Triangle is the UK's version of the Ivy League. This is Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College London, sometimes Durham. The University of Durham likes to think that it's in this group. But this is the old money, the old prestige. Oxford and Cambridge educational models are quite particular and quite different from what exists at other UK institutions. What you're probably most familiar with if you went to a PhD program in the US at an R1 institution, that is most equivalent to the Russell Group, which are research-intensive universities. There are 24 of them. These are the names of institutions you've probably heard of in the UK, at least some of them that are not Oxford and Cambridge. So LSE, UCL, Nottingham, where I work, is one. And these are very similar to R1s in the US. You also have post-92 universities. Quickest way that I could explain this is that pre-1992, there were a bunch of polytechnic and vocational schools in the UK that in 1992 were made quote unquote real universities. This is a whole thing. As you might expect from these being newer institutions that sort of got promoted up in the hierarchy, they tend to be thought of as less good, even though that is objectively often not true. They tend to have fewer resources as well, but still be very good schools. And then you also have further education, tertiary colleges. These are similar to US community colleges, another kind of institution that exists. So fewer institutions, fewer kinds of institutions in the UK. But if you see any of these terms like Russell Group post-92, this is sort of what that means. Okay, so different kinds of institutions. Then if you want to get a job at those institutions, what do those jobs actually look like? In the US, if you're not from the US, you've probably heard of the tenure track as a sort of weird nebulous thing. Let me explain what this is. The tenure track is a 7-ish, depending year, probationary period. Hold on a second, chat. This may be helpful. Just a notion of mission groups as well. Yeah, okay, thank you for that point, Emily. We can circle back. The tenure track is a 7-ish year probationary period. You can think of it like a promotion application in the UK, where at the end of the period, in most cases, if you're successful, you will be promoted to an associate professor. However, unlike in the UK, you don't get to choose when you do this. You're mandated to submit that tenure application by a certain point. If your application is unsuccessful, if you're judged to not have enough publications, not to have done enough teaching, et cetera, you're not just not promoted, you're out of a job. If you are successful, you are quote unquote tenured and you're permanent for life. So this can be quite stressful, depending on what kind of institution you're at, especially for folks at R1s who spend the first 5, 6, 7 years of their job publishing as much as they can, really trying to work hard so that they get tenure and they're set. Most assistant professor jobs in the US that you will see advertised are tenure track. That's often what that title means. If it says assistant professor of whatever, it's probably tenure track. The job ad will say so. So check that. Most of these are research and teaching. Assistant teaching professor jobs also exist, which are similar to T&L jobs in the UK, more focused on teaching. But again, the type of institution is going to tell you more about the balance of research and teaching than the job title necessarily. Much like in the UK, the US is beset by casualized jobs. We call these non-tenure track positions. There are non-tenure track positions that are more permanent, but these are quite rare and it's unlikely you're going to encounter them in most of your job searches. As in the UK, about 1/3 of the academic workforce in the US is casualized, and that number is growing. There are a lot of ways that the job ad might signal to you that this is a casual position. Words like lecturer, instructor, visiting assistant professor, adjunct professor. These are all signs that this is a casual position, not something that's not permanent, where you're not going to have a tenure review. Might be for a semester, a year, 2 years, et cetera. Instead of casualized, we say adjunct or adjunctified in the US, but it's the same concept. Postdocs are also a thing. These can be shorter than in the UK. 1 to 2 years generally, at least in the social sciences. These can be longer in the natural sciences. But the sort of, and this is not necessarily a UK specific fact, but the European model where postdocs are 3, 4, 5 years, not a thing. So that sort of long probationary period is not really a thing, at least in the social sciences in the US. In the UK, the tenure track is not a thing. It's not a thing. This is perhaps one of the more appealing parts of the UK market to folks from the US, if, big caveat, you are able to get one of the coveted permanent positions. And I'm speaking from quite a position of privilege here, having gone into a permanent position in the UK. You're either permanent, which means that when your contract starts, you are essentially tenured. You're an assistant professor, but you are tenured. Or you're casualized, you're an adjunct, et cetera. It is expected that you'll go up for a promotion, that you will apply to be promoted to an associate professor or to a full professor, if for no other reason than your salary will go up. But you have more flexibility in terms of choosing when you do that within some general departmental university norms. But just because you've decided this year, oh, I'm not going to go up for associate this year, you can't be fired. for choosing that option. If you're on a permanent contract, look for that word in job ads, permanent. That means essentially tenured. Permanent jobs in the UK, the way that the rankings work, and here US terminology is continuing to infiltrate this, but you're going to see both. Assistant professor and lecturer are usually synonyms. Associate professor and reader are synonyms, and professor is professor. These can be research and teaching jobs, R&T, or teaching and learning jobs, T&L, where the focus is more on teaching and student service. An important thing to note, if you are from the US, this is something I still have trouble wrapping my head around, and I inadvertently promote my colleagues all the time in my head. The title professor is only used for those at the rank of full professor. If you are not a full professor, you are addressed as doctor. So students, when they call me professor, I have to correct them and say, no, I'm not a professor, I'm Dr. Meier. Whereas in the US, I could say I'm Professor Meier, and that would be accurate. So just something to be careful of if you're from the US. Casualized jobs will have similar titles. It will not be immediately apparent all the time from the actual title in the job ad, whether it's permanent or casualized. So you're going to have to click through and see whether the job ad says that this is a fixed term position or a 0 hours position. And that's your signal that, oh, this is a 1 semester, 1 year adjunct kind of position. And these exist at similar rates as they do in the US. Postdocs are things. They can be longer than you might be used to in the US if you're not a natural scientist. 2 to 3 years, shorter ones also exist. There are also research fellow, teaching fellow kind of jobs that are intended to bridge that period between when you finish your PhD and that time when you're sort of on the market looking for a permanent job. There's lots of variation here, but these are all jobs for people with PhDs. Okay, that's a quick overview of the actual sort of process of going on the market. Job applications. What do applications sort of look like? What do you have to do for them? In the US, there are lots of application materials. Are all these materials strictly necessary? I don't think so, but I don't make decisions. In the US, for most jobs, again, there's lots of variation here. You will need to submit a cover letter and a CV. This is relatively normal. You will likely have to submit a research statement about your overall research interests and goals within your projects and what those look like, a statement of teaching philosophy, sort of how you approach teaching in the classroom, your teaching experience, a writing sample or multiple writing samples sometimes, and then letters of recommendation, is sort of the standard package. Less common, but still required often enough that I feel like putting them on here is worth it, are evidence of teaching effectiveness, which is code for teaching evaluations. This assumes that you've taught, or either as a GTA or as an instructor of record, your own class. Sample syllabi are sometimes requested, UK terminology, module guides. You may have to submit a diversity statement, which is EDI in UK terminology, about your approach to and feelings towards diversity. You might have to submit transcripts, and these are all things that I had to submit multiple times while on the US job market, but slightly less common. UK applications are generally more streamlined. For most jobs, you will need to submit a cover letter, a CV, and letters of reference, and that sort of stops there. Not always. Less common things that are sometimes requested. These are all things I had to submit with different applications that I made to UK institutions, writing samples, a module outline, which is similar to a course proposal. If this is something you're asked to do, please contact someone at a UK university and ask them what this means. I don't have time to go into it right now, but it's very different than a US syllabus. You might have to submit a research statement, a statement of teaching philosophy, or an EDI, or a diversity kind of statement. If you're writing a cover letter to a UK job, I'm going to try and speed up a little bit here because we've hit the half-hour mark. Some things you might want to mention or emphasize and maybe aren't super intuitive. Grants. I cannot emphasize enough, especially if you're from the US. Grants are so important in the UK, regardless of discipline. This is only becoming more and more true. If you've gotten one as a grad student, fantastic, mention it. If you haven't, that's okay. talk about your plans for getting a grant, getting multiple grants. Even if you don't have plans, like don't lie, but make some, because your institution, if you get a job over here, will make you make plans. There are some funding bodies you should be familiar with. These are our equivalents of things like the NSF. But the main funding bodies that you might want to look at are the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, for folks in the social sciences, the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the British Academy, the Leverhulme Trust. There aren't a ton of funding sources in the UK, but the ones that do exist are quite large, and they're these. Publications matter, just as they do in the US. How much they matter depends on where we are in the REF cycle. I do not have time to dive into the full monster that is REF, but it's a term you will hear on the UK job market. REF is the Research Excellence Framework. It is a government level program, and it governs UK higher ed with an iron fist. How it does that is quite complicated, but the point that matters for you is that the closer we are to a REF submission deadline, which happens about every 7 years, the more publications matter, because part of doing the REF is submitting your faculty's publications to this system. It's a whole thing. The next REF deadline is probably going to be 27, 28. So you're in a good position right now, but just things to keep in mind. You might also want to think about journal hierarchies being different in the UK. We are socialized, at least in my discipline, so much in the US to think about these as very strict and to really go for these so constructed, top tier, enormous general interest kinds of journals, and anything that's not that is considered kind of lesser. That's less the case in the UK. Things that wouldn't count at a USR1 will probably count here and be viewed as impressive, which is great because hierarchies are silly. Quick note on ADI decolonization. Much like diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a buzzword that means nothing at most US institutions, decolonization has taken on a similar flair in the UK. If you're like, I don't really know much about like repatriation of land and reparations to colonized people. Neither does anyone in UK management. But these are things that you might be expected to mention in a cover letter or an interview, your experience with or thoughts on equality, diversity, and inclusion, and or decolonization of the curriculum. If you have real thoughts on these things, those are fantastic and great to share with the attendant risks that always come with expressing unpopular viewpoints. In the US, some things that you might want to emphasize, mention in a cover letter. In terms of how to balance things that you're mentioning in that cover letter, if you're applying for a research and teaching job, a job that includes really both of those things and really emphasizes research especially, spend about 2/3 to 3/4 of your cover letter talking about research, 1/4 to 1/3 talking about teaching. If you're applying to more of a teaching focused job, a job at a liberal arts college, a regional public institution, reverse that, more or less. An important terminology thing to note is that in the US, the term service means administration in the UK sense. So whereas in the UK, we talk about research, teaching, and admin, in the US, we say research, teaching, and service. Admin has a different meaning in the US. It is synonymous with management. That's probably not what you mean unless you have career aspirations to be a dean or a provost. So just be careful with that. Grants are still cool. They are simply less important in the US outside the natural sciences than they are in the UK. That's not to say they don't matter. If you have one, talk about it. But it's just, the emphasis is just not the same. This is changing slowly, but right now it's just not comparable. So just things to note. UK students in particular, I think all grad students have this tendency to undersell themselves and downplay their accomplishments. UK students in particular, in my experience, have this tendency. Resist. Do not do this. Talk yourself up. You are the greatest person you ever met in your cover letter. You can be bolder than you would in a UK job application in the US. You just can. One important thing to include in a US cover letter is your viva date, defense date in US terminology. This is because you're probably applying on the US market before you have a PhD, or that's the expectation anyway. If you've already defended, fantastic. If you haven't, this can be approximate, for example, June 2023, but do put in when you expect to finish if you haven't finished yet. And then the same note that I gave on decolonization and EDI on the previous slide about the UK applies to the US in terms of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, just a reversal of the acronym. Same note on that being a buzzword that universities are ostensibly very interested in, but are interested in a very narrow view on that. Still, if you can speak to that, it's worth doing. All right. It's taking me longer than I thought to go through. Sorry, I like to talk. Real quickly, let's skate through the interview process. Let's imagine a best case scenario where you get invited to an interview. Yay, congrats to yourself, pat yourself on the back, and then this is how you prep. In the US, a typical interview, now that we at least like to pretend that we're in a post-COVID world, will be a campus visit. It could still be a virtual visit. Most of these will be in person. It takes place over at least one full day, possibly more, depending on how many meetings the hiring committee wants to schedule you for. What this will consist of is a job talk. This is a 40-ish minute talk on your dissertation. It is a research talk. It is similar to something you might give at a conference or a workshop, just longer. You will do that. You will do an interview with the hiring committee. You will have meetings with individual faculty to get to know them, but these are also assessment opportunities. You will get to meet with students, usually, depending on the job. They might be grad students, they might be undergrads. You will probably have dinner with some faculty. And you might have to do a teaching demo, but that's less common. Depends on the institution. In the UK, the interview, which could be in person or virtual, my institution is still doing virtual interviews, is much faster. It takes place over a few hours. If it's virtual, those hours might be spread out over a couple of days, but we're talking 2 hours or 3 hours of your time, rather than 8 to 12 to 15. It's just different. And I can talk about why in the Q&A if people are curious. What this will consist of, and there's some variation here, as a job talk, but unlike in the US, in most places, this is going to be shorter, and it's going to sometimes be like a full verbal CV. So instead of talking us through your dissertation for 40 minutes, you might have to instead talk us through quick overview of your research, quick overview of your teaching, quick overview of your service, admin, and future plans. It's different. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. You'll do an interview with the hiring committee, and in most cases, including at research-intensive institutions, you will do a teaching demo of some kind. It'll be short, but you will still do one. So things to be aware of. Some tips when you're interviewing in the UK, and this extends to other application materials as well. This is something you may not realize if you're from the US. No one in the room except the hiring panel probably knows anything about you. This process that we have in the US, where we Google every single person who gets to be interviewed, where we read all their application materials, that's not a thing in the UK. No one except the hiring panel has seen any of your application materials. And there are fewer of them too, remember. So start from the beginning. Really assume no one has ever heard of you. I'm going to assume that you can talk about your teaching, but some more specific things about your research, because again, in the UK, this really doesn't matter. Again, grants, really important. Talk about your grant plans. My research doesn't require big grants, just something I've seen several US applicants say in interviews. It's the wrong answer, even if it's true. Come up with something. Mention campus research centers, if there are any, interdisciplinary collaboration opportunities, if you can think of those. These are very attractive. Resist the urge to name drop. Several people in the UK have told me they find this off-putting. In the sense of, oh, I worked with so-and-so, or I on my co-authored paper with so-and-so. Don't do that. In terms of talking through your research in a job talk scenario, your precise findings matter less. Mention your projects and the outputs from those projects. Output is jargon for publications. Don't walk me through precisely everything that you did in that project. You don't have time, and it's not the right use of your time. The term impact, which you might hear about and which you might get asked about, Impact means, in US terminology, public engagement, bridging the gap style work. It does not mean journal impact factors. It means public engagement. And then one last note for social scientists, if you are applying in the UK market, you probably already know this, but this is a far more qualitative, interpretive, relational, critical kind of academic space. Do not throw up coefficient plots and other quant stuff, even if you think that's very basic in your discipline. Obviously, natural scientists, economists, do what you want. But for the rest of us, the reason I say that is because the minute you do that, you have lost 75% of the room. And not in the US, oh, I don't do quant kind of way. In the, I don't have any training in this and I have no idea what's going on kind of way. Do not do this. Happy to expand on that more if folks have questions. Some interview tips for the US. We're almost done, I promise. Be prepared. If you are somebody from the UK on the US market, you will get substantive questions about your research. Again, this might feel like a conference or workshop presentation. You're going to get things like, how does your research apply to my case? Can you explain this theoretical concept more? Can you talk through the methodological decisions you made here? These are not questions you will probably get in a UK interview. So be prepared to talk through this kind of stuff. You should expect that everyone in the room has looked you up and may have seen more or fewer of your application materials. These are often circulated to all faculty who are attending these talks. A side note to this, if you're serious about the US market, you need to build yourself a website or have someone build one for you. You need a website. This is not as common in the UK for academics, include grad students and people higher up. But in the US, you need a website and you really need one in the UK too. This is my hill I will die on. Build yourself a website. People are going to Google you and they're going to think it's weird if they can't find you. At teaching-focused institutions in the US, you will get questions about specific teaching scenarios. This is again a little bit different than you might get in the UK. Give this some thought. I've linked to some examples of real questions that I got on the market. Okay, last thing that I will say, and this is my small, like 2-minute concession to structural issues that govern this entire situation, which we've skirted around so far, but it's worth thinking about the larger socio-political environments that you're stepping into in either country. You should know that in the UK, academic jobs pay less, and I feel pretty confident saying this, than every US R1 job at the same level. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, less than jobs at R2s, liberal arts schools, et cetera. You may have any number of other reasons for wanting to work in the UK. And I should certainly say that permanent job salaries outside of London, at least, are still livable, at least in my experience, but they are lower. And if you have debt, or dependents, this is something to consider. What you are doing for that money, you're probably going to be doing more service and more grading than you're used to, especially if you were trained at a US R1 and if you were sort of expecting to get a US R1 job. You will probably do it with less research money, unless you can get external grants. But there are trade-offs here, right? Research expectations in UK institutions are lower than at US R1s. Again, lots of variation in US institutions, but in terms of what you might have been trained to expect, lower research expectations. There's more appetite for people doing qualitative, critical work. I've never had to justify that approach here. That's the kind of work that I do. People get it, and that's really nice. Your salary is paid over 12 months. There are pros and cons to that, but things to consider. Free healthcare, the asterisk is because the NHS, the Tories are trying to destroy it. And also you will pay an immigrant health surcharge. It's still going to be less than your insurance premiums in the US, but not quite free. You will get lots of paid vacation days, shorter semesters, generally speaking. There are trade-offs here to keep in mind. I should also note, in both countries, we are experiencing unprecedented waves of strike action. In the US, there isn't a single national union for faculty like UCU, the University and College Union in the UK. So a lot of these strikes are really coming from graduate students, although you may have seen, if you follow US news for some reason, that currently all faculty, staff, and grad students at Rutgers, which is a university in New York, are currently on strike, which is unusual, but cool to see. In the UK, and this is happening across the entire higher education sector, There's a long history of strike action here. It's far more common than if you're coming from the US. How you feel about that is up to you. Whether you participate is up to you, but it's something to be aware of. Okay, I have talked for long enough. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the screen share. We did that. I'm going to stop the recording so people can speak freely and ask questions.